Thank you. Díomh cuairte go léir tá anóthas ar an bheith an seo inniu, agus is mór an in oré bheith san óid speisialta seo I Caintlibh. A number of people this morning expressed sympathy with me that I was the speaker following Ian. I sat there and I certainly know why. But I'm really very grateful to have this invitation to be here, to be one of the speakers, and thank you, Joe. And I think it's also just to be in this beautiful part of the world in terms of mental health, to be in such a beautiful place and to be absorbed and embraced by all that it is, and in terms of friendship and acceptance and conversation and music and merriment and musings and light-hearted profundity and deep recognition of what we could be together if we could make it so, because that is what this is about. We are none of us here without a real desire to look at what are the issues, how can we resolve them, what do we need, how do we tackle? I mean, those perspectives on alcohol and the impact of it on us, on our lives, on our mental health. These are the things we're here to address. I think in terms of context, what I'm going to say this morning is really very much as a clinical psychologist. I've worked for 40 years as a clinical psychologist. And over that time, I suppose I've seen so many changes, and yet there's one enduring thing. And I think it goes back to George Kelly, who says, when all else fails, and you still don't know what's wrong with the client, ask them, and they will tell you. And in that regard, I want to share a story with you. Some of you may have heard me recount it before, but it was in 1975 when I was a brand new, shiny psychologist working on one of the new multidisciplinary teams. We had psychiatrists, we had paediatrician, we had a social worker, we had a speech and language therapist, and we all devoted a morning, some hours, to assessing children where there was a question that they may have some developmental delay. And we all did our work for the morning. And at the end, we decided that we would go and bring the mother, and her mother was with her, the grandmother, up to talk to us, to tell them what we had found. Because we had sadly found that this child of 4, almost 5, was functioning much more like a 2-year-old. And as I walked up the corridor with the mother and the grandmother, the granny said, sure, he's just like a 2-year-old. I think if I were to say what was the most important training, experience, insight, theoretical position of my entire career, for want of a better word, it was that. Because I recognised in that within us, we do hold the answers. We know in the way that we have always known at some level what is right and wrong in our society. And we know what we need. And therefore, in this mental mehel that is McGill, the threads of both hope and despair that bind us as people, they've really been evident in these sessions this week. I mean, if we look at topics such as, will we have a new politics or unstable governance? What lies at the core of decades of inadequate governance and crisis? What are the vital functions of democracy? What about the justice system and the trauma when justice is thwarted or denied? All these sessions this week provide us with reflective opportunities for each of us to consider how we position ourselves individually, collectively, personally, professionally and political at this time in our history of our country, amidst so many discourses of disappointment, denial, distrust and discontent. Because mental health and well-being, they're not separate from any of the issues being discussed here this week. I mean, there are distinctions, and I know They need to be drawn between, if you like, ordinary human misery, as Freud described it, and periods or temporary periods of great stress and distress and enduring mental health problems. But essentially, mental stress and distress, they don't arise in a vacuum. They're not located just within the individual, but in the society, in the culture, in the community, or the lack of community, in the resources that we have or we don't have, in the way that we live. And whether or not these contexts in which we live are conducive to mental health or have undermined people's well-being and capacity to cope, these are the questions. It takes a village to rear a child, we know. But it takes a community to sustain mental well-being. And those policies that really upset me of dismantling communities, closure of local Garda stations, with the loss of positive presence in a community, the sense of security for older people, the threat to post offices, they are the finest therapeutic clinics we have. Thank you. I'm glad you shared that view. The false, I suppose, the facelessness of a lot of services. Where a bank has become a bank of computers. The lack of planning, whereby local shops close because large malls and edifices outside the city erase them. And the loss of young people from rural Ireland, from all of Ireland, to emigration. The villages in which there are no longer the makings of a GAA team. And could there be a more supportive mental health intervention than the community and the sense of worth and achievement that derives from that? And of course we know the property catastrophe and sent young people out to commuter outposts away from the support of their families. And then we've had these awful discourses that have set citizens against each other. Why would we set the private sector against the public servants? Why would we do that? Who are the public servants? There's so many of us, the nurses, the teachers, the people working at the coalface, becoming burnt out if we have a mental health issue. It can be burnout, because those who go into the mental health area usually, and I've worked with them, do so from a position of real idealism, energy, purpose, a wish and a longing to do something that matters. And that, when that gets thwarted, and when people get overwhelmed, and when they feel that they can't do anything. Like Blake said, can I see another's woe and not be in sorrow too? This is the experience. Ian has spoken about the drinks industry, and how on earth is it allowed to self-regulate and set its own codes and do so much of what it does? We've had the attack on pensions, and we've had this sense of grovelling in some way for what we need. And of course we've heard about the trolleys in A&Es. So mental health is not necessarily just some absolutely separate service. It's about living our lives. And I know that these catalogues of discontent, they've been reiterated to the extent that there's now almost a kind of an ennui, a desensitisation almost to the repetition. But in terms of mental health, politicians, and they do, and so many do, have to acknowledge that the decisions that they make and have made, these have mental health consequences. And it's worth looking, if you look at the work by Dr. David Smale, the late Dr. David Smale now, very interesting about that sense in community. Because anger gets internalised and often converted into anxiety and depression. And you can't, as the brochure says, ignore the fact that recession triggered a sharp increase in mental distress, or that over 1,000 men in the construction industry took their lives. We know that 1 of 4 of us will require some kind of professional help with a mental health problem. And I know that you addressed that, Pat. I think we are on the same page from slightly different perspectives, because we do have to draw that distinction between mental disorder and mental distress, and not to pathologise ordinary suffering. How do we draw these distinctions? I think I'm just so glad that you're going to address that. And of course we have that terrible burden for families coping with serious, enduring mental illness. That is huge suffering. That is, as one mother said, every day, hoping, wondering, how will it be today? How will I give back confidence to my son? How will he have experiences of himself that make him feel worthwhile? And of course we do have, and we have increasingly, and they are so welcome, the mental health rehabilitation services. And they're there to provide treatment and support and really to help people with complex needs to regain the skills and the confidence to achieve their goals, to live independently, to engage in activities, to have relationships, to have income, to have somewhere to live, to have self-respect. Respect, that word so precious to the young. You can never disrespect them because that's all they ask, respect. We need more of these services. And we know that when normal distress persists and when it goes unattended, that it can become pathology. And it can pick up, as Ian has so eloquently pointed out, with the abuse of alcohol and with the abuse of drugs, then it becomes something that it need not have been if we could have got in earlier. And we also know, and even recently from the very tragic situation in Berkeley, that when things are attended to in a compassionate, kindly way at community level, it provides what people need. The national response to disaster in that tragedy. It just gave us an example of how much community support and care mean. The opening up of the community places, the schools were there, the churches were there, people were meeting and talking about their feelings, people were understanding the normal, appropriate responses to bereavement, to trauma, to all of those complex emotions when something happens. Visible disaster, it's a wonderful quality we have. Visible disaster brings out the best in us. But there are too many invisible disasters. Lives and situations, lived out, lonely lives, they shrink. Talent shrunk to inattention to their distress because there is nowhere to go in time. That's the crucial factor. I'm not going to talk about the statistics and males and so on. We know this. But what I do think is important in this session, even within the title of it, is we're talking about our mental health. Because it's the word our that recognises we are in this together, all of us, government, citizens, each of us with a responsibility. A responsibility to be and to say and to do what is going to always lighten the person we encounter rather than burden them. The title, Our Mental Health, does not separate the provider from the consumer. It doesn't take an expert stance. What we're looking at is a really fundamental human issue, how we perceive and are perceived in our world, how we're supported or unsupported, and what is required to bring hope to those in distress. Because in all the conversations, it is hope that people want, hope that they may get better, hope that they may be able to go out today, hope that they may be able to go further, hope that they may be able to join in some vocational activity or take some job or have a sense of being part of a community. And that's why we had the wonderful closing of the institutions and the opening up of community services. And those that we have, I think they are wonderful. I know there's some terrific services here in Donegal. I saw Anne Sheridan this morning, and I know there's been policies and things. There's so much happening. But I want to draw your attention to some of the headlines if we want to look at what's happening in our world. I picked some headlines, and most of them are this week or last week. The courts hear over 1,300 300 home repossession cases in 10 days. The highest number of cases. They took place in Dundalk, Cork, Trim, Clonmel, Portneash, Naas, Tralee and Nina. What's happening to those people? And the highest number of cases, 131, took place in Letterkenny. We have the headline that says child protection bosses express concern over high-risk cases. A TUSLA report found some child protection managers, they're not satisfied that high-risk children are being kept safe. We have 300 children waiting for mental health services, HSE figures show. And at the end of last year, there were more than 3,000 children and teenagers waiting to access services, and more than 400 of these were waiting for over a year. Childhood is short. A child who waits years waits their childhood. So many of our young people suffer from mental health problems by the age of 24. And often if we can just get in there and reassure them and normalise the experience and let them know you're okay. You are okay. The impact that has. 300 Irish children called the ISPCC Childline threatening suicide in 2004. We know from Headstrong and the Jigsaw programmes, and again there's one here in Donegal, 1 in 10 young people who presented to Jigsaw had thought about suicide. And they found that 89% of them had some clinical levels of distress. I'm not talking about disorder, but distress. And they were really helped with support. And then I suppose there are those pieces of newspaper headlines that jar. And I hate to say, taxpayers to pay $56,000 for a Doyle fitness instructor. July the 17th, 2015, the House of the Oireachtas confirmed it has appointed an online fitness instructor to manage and fund gym at government buildings. The key to success in any mental health situation is detect and treat. Early recognition and immediate intervention are crucial. The World Health Organization, it's very clear about the importance of this in controlling symptoms and improving outcomes. In mental health, as in all these things, there's often a critical time in which intervention is most effective and full recovery is most likely to occur. Delay simply increases the risk of self-harm. The economic cost is staggeringly high. The metrics are clear, the ethics are clear. Let's get in, identify quickly. And the magnitude of mental illness on families is just so enormous. And we know again how people self-medicate and the breakdown then in family relationships. From an economic perspective, cost of illness studies in relation to mental ill health highlight the tragic loss of talent, of personal attainment, of educational aspirations and of employment. State coffers are depleted by public ill health. And it costs so much more than necessary if we could just again get in quickly. And I know there are so many moves to do that. And we welcome them. We welcome anything that supports in a timely way. And of course, the ultimate tragedy for really delayed intervention can sometimes be death. And for too many families in Ireland have shed too many tears for the loss of young life, for gifted, talented, beautiful young life, ended and irretrievable. So I want to finish just looking at psychosis, which is, the first episode in psychosis is reported as experienced by about 1,200 people per year, about 700 people with schizophrenia. It often develops in males in late teens, early adulthood, and psychotic episodes, the simple episodes, can be much more common than we think. People can have a psychotic symptom. And the common signs of this can be anxiety, social withdrawal from family, suspiciousness, sleep disturbance, poor motivation and concentration. And then there may be bizarre or false delusional belief, confused thinking and mood changes. Help is always required, and immediate help is the most important thing. So in terms of a message of hope, I want to talk about one of many services, because one of the services, as a real exemplar of some of the terrific services we have, is the Detect service, which many of you may know about. Free service, part of the existing public mental health service. It's funded on a day-to-day basis by the HSE and St John of God services, and its objective is that early intervention and recovery. And what happens is that with services of that kind, it's efficient, it's cost-effective, it works, and there are many throughout the country. If you read the Mental Health Commission reports and its review of a vision for change, showing how significant, how crucial and how valuable these services are. Because we are none of us immune from the possibility of becoming mentally unwell or distressed. The potential is there. We can be psychologically overwhelmed, we can be occupationally depleted, and we can really feel broken. It is much better to resource early than to pick up the tab. So on a final note, I don't have all the technology, I hope I haven't, I'm watching it here. I just want to say there are really positive things. We live in a democracy where our ministers, with great good nature, allow us to identify for them what we believe needs to be done, and they listen to us. I believe they do, and we're always so grateful at the attendance, I think, at events such as this. We have organisations that care. I could list hundreds: Console, Grow, Aware, See Change, Beta House, Headstrong. We have people who care. Our stomachs are not empty of pity, to quote the poet Patrick McGill, the namesake of this event. We cannot prevent all illnesses, but we can take the knowledge that we have and into plans, wellness recovery plans, multidisciplinary intervention, vocational rehabilitation, supportive employment, self-help, family therapy. The sense of shame and stigma that continues to silence people who find themselves or their family members either temporarily or enduringly unable to cope cries out for the provision of compassionate, adequately resourced, equally distributed, equitable, timely, responsive and available services. We are at the crossroads. Let's take the right road. Thank you.